Hello, hello, and welcome to Fine, I'll Talk About It, the podcast where we say the quiet parts out loud. Real talk, straight to the point, no fake positivity. I'm your host, Danielle Young, and today I'm joined by Claire Meredith, all the way from the UK. Claire is a speaker, writer, and coach in Cornwall, UK. She works with individuals and businesses, helping them plan their next move and remove the obstacles to transformation and growth. And I'm super excited about today's episode because we are talking all about leaving a religion and religious indoctrination. So, Claire, welcome to Fine. I'll talk about it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dive into this with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you first, and then we'll get right to it.
Thanks. Yeah, so I am a coach and I work with individuals and businesses. I live in the UK. I grew up here. I'm British. And I live in a beautiful part of the UK, actually, in right by the sea in Cornwall. So it's been a journey to get here. It's not where I grew up. And I'll be talking a bit about my childhood as well and growing up in religion. Yeah. So I'm really pleased to be here.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming up. So, you grew up in a religious family.
I
Go.
did. Yeah. It was normal for me. It was church every Sunday, sometimes twice or three times on a Sunday when I was into my teen years. Then I didn't question it. I loved it. It was a great part of my life. And I look very differently on it now, having left that community, Christianity itself. But yes, I remember going to school and feeling shocked that not everyone went to church because it was such a normal part of my life and it was such an accepted part of my life. And that has a lot of positives that go with it in some ways, but also a lot of beliefs and ideas that when you believe them as a child, difficult to undo as an adult, I found.
Yeah. And you grew up in which church?
It was an independent evangelical church. So rather than one of the mainstream kind of denominations like Baptist or Methodist or Church of England, it was independent in its own belief. So it didn't have like a mother church or a national organization. And it calls itself independent evangelical. It counts itself as an evangelical, but also independent. But it came from a nonconformist faction, which was basically not the Church of England, called these nonconformist churches. And the faction is called the Brethren. There's two types of Brethren. There's open Brethren, which is a much more mainstream type church. And then there's closed Brethren, which are much more exclusive. The church didn't call itself Brethren at any point by the time I was born and was attending. They had very sort of basic beliefs in terms of the Bible was the authority, and they didn't have any of the frills around, I don't know, the incense of the Catholic Church, and they didn't have the sort of tradition of the Church of England. It was very much back to basics, which I, at the time, thought was logical and normal because I didn't know any different, really. But I think the Brethren beliefs, were still quite prevalent when I was growing up, but it styled itself as independent. It didn't sort of associate so much with the Brethren beliefs now, and certainly the Brethren Church is regarded, some of the Brethren churches are regarded as a very culty church now. Plymouth Brethren, Exclusive Brethren, they have different names. That was the more closed version, the more sort of strict version. So it basically had its own kind of beliefs about Christianity that I would say still counted as one of the mainstream churches in the town I grew up. And it was similar beliefs to Baptists of possibly some Methodist beliefs as well. So all in all, I would have said I went to a normal church. Wasn't Church of England, but it was, it was a fairly popular church. A few hundred people went, regularly. So it's only since I've left that perhaps I would question that idea now. But it was, I went to church. I was one of the people, it was the 80s in the UK. Some people still went to church. It wasn't that, unusual. Yeah, I was, but yeah, looking back, it's maybe a different story for me now.
Yeah. Was there ever a point when you were in the church that you started questioning things, or was it just after you got out?
Yeah,
But
it's a question. It's a question I've asked myself. When I was about 16, one of the church leaders, I think it was like a church event, and I was a waitress. It was a food thing, and so I was volunteered to be a waitress. They had like a kitchen and everything, so they could put on these kind of events. And it's quite an unusual event, but I just sort of stepped up. And the church leader mentioned something like, "Oh, you're one of our success stories," as in I'd been through the church, I think want to say this is what I thought he was alluding to. I'd been through the church youth groups. I was born in the church, and I sort of got to 16 and I was still in the church, and I was committed Christian. And I sort of felt at that point, like, hang on, like, I'm like a cog in the wheel. Like, I'm not me as a person. I'm just a success story to the church. And I don't know that's what he meant exactly, but there was just something in my mind that just went, hang on, like, is that how I really want to be thought of? Like, is that how you see me? Is that like that I'm a success of the gospel? Like, what does that mean? And where's, I think, like, I guess myself was a bit kind of taken aback that I didn't have any recognition just for being me. You know, I was valued as a person, I believed in that scenario, but that the way they were thinking about it just didn't feel good at all. So that was the first, the only time I can remember that I questioned, like, the motive.
Yeah, how can you be a success story
Right.
in religion? What
I
does that
think
even
because
mean?
I think because I'd become a Christian, like, I'd been grown up in the church, I'd been grown up around it, and I'd stayed the course, I'd become a Christian, and you know, I mean, I was only 16, it wasn't like my whole life had
Eh,
been lived, and you know, I was like, whoa, I'd
uh,
done it, I managed it. But yeah, it just left, it made me question how they thought of the church, I guess, and what its role was. And that, yeah, it raised it. It was like a little red flag, I guess, that I didn't really recognize at the time, but looking back, that came to mind as a red flag, I guess.
that would be a big red flag for me,
Yeah,
you
and
know?
you
Let's
don't see it at that point, so you know,
No. You wouldn't. I mean, like you said, you were 16, you know?
yeah,
Like, but you were aware enough to
yeah.
question it and to ask, what exactly does this mean?
Yeah. And I think, but again, like, you know, it wasn't, church was so much a normal part of my life that I didn't, and quite significantly different from some of my school friends who didn't, you know, they didn't go to church. They didn't go to church youth groups. And so they didn't have perhaps so much of a social life as me. They didn't have the community that I had because of the church. And that sort of social circle was, you know, very important, you know, in my growing up and my development. So I counted myself lucky, but I think that was that. So that where, you know, it was always a positive thing until that moment where I think, hang on, is this supposed to, am I serving them? Are they serving me? And of course I believed I was to serve in the church, but I was kind of like, what was the end goal here? Is it my, you know, spiritual life, or was it the progression of the church? And yeah, that was one of the things that, yeah, came up in my memory looking back.
So what was the defining moment when you said, you know what, I'm done. I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, I'd returned from university, having been attended a church at university, and it was a different city. So it was 3 years out of my home church, but in a very similar church. And I came back, was looking for a job, and I started dating this guy in the church who had been. They ran a voluntary scheme for people who wanted to kind of experience or contribute to the church life, but weren't paid. They were voluntary, unpaid. So the idea was that you get a job that was paid to support you while you were doing this voluntary work. And it, you know, it included sort of learning how to speak up the front, as well as helping with youth groups and making coffee and moving chairs and stuff. So admin, all sorts of things. So this guy was quite well known in the church, and we had some mutual friends, so we kind of were hanging out a bit. And we dated for a few months, very quite casually. But because I was known in the church, having grown up there, and because he was known in the church because of this scheme that I think he finished at that point, but there were people sort of making noises about marriage and, you know, asking kind of about getting married. And, you know, we were both in our 20s, and in the church I grew up in, it was no sex before marriage was taught as a rule. And so young people tended to marry young because of that.
Yeah.
And so that, you know, in that, it was very common, the kind of purity culture, which is something I was familiar with. That was a message growing up. And so people making these noises, and I was kind of like, hang on, I'm not quite ready for that yet. And in any case, we parted ways. It kind of felt, the relationship kind of felt a bit stale, and I wasn't really, we were both busy, and it didn't feel like we were both, you know, on the same page. And some time went by, we were still kind of mixing in the same circles, but he was arrested and convicted of an offence against a child. Knowing the stories I know today, it could have been a lot more serious, but it was serious enough. Any any situation involving a child and abuse is I believe horrific and shouldn't happen in this day and age.
Yeah, for sure.
And it made me question everything, not least, of course, that, I read a newspaper report where I could match dates when I'd seen this guy. And those were dates that he'd been chatting on chat rooms, as it was then, with young girls. And that was devastating. Like, oh, I saw you that afternoon in the morning, you'd been on your computer. And it completely made me question everything, because this was my good Christian man boyfriend who was known in the church. I had in that academic year in the September had started the same kind of voluntary scheme that he'd done. So some people knew me through that. Some people had known me since growing up. So I was very visible in the church as well. And people had known we were together. Some people hadn't known we were broken up when this news broke. So for me, it was a really devastating thing to find out, but also people knew that I was associated with him. And it was just a questioning of everything that, how the Christian men in my life were supposed to be the good ones, and the ones outside the church were bad. And this was kind of came from a brethren belief that you should be separate from the world. And whilst the church that I grew up in did not preach that per se, I know that had been the legacy of the church, some of the church history before I was born, several years before I was born. You were kind of supposed to keep within, your church community, and everywhere else was a bit misguided at best. They might be heathen, but if we're going to be nice about it, they were, they should just believe in God, and they weren't. So they were bad. So I'd grown up with this idea that basically, and particularly in dating situations, the ones in the church were the good ones, that those were the ones you marry, and the ones outside were not. So to not trust non-Christian men, and then find out that the Christian one that you were dating had essentially hidden a lot from everyone and was now, convicted of this offense. He didn't go to jail. I found out later that there's with the sort of lesser offences, I mean, again, the distinctions seem a little arbitrary, but they sort of have rehabilitation, sort of therapeutic approaches and non-jail time, because what can happen is that with sexual offences particularly, abusers can learn more in jail than if they're a sort of first-time offender, which he was. So yeah. Well, in the UK anyway, that's their approach, because if they offend on a smaller scale, then they can just, if they go to jail, they can just learn more. So just, exactly.
I suppose it could be true here as well. I mean,
right. I'm not familiar, but
yeah.
exactly. So I was devastated, and I stayed in the church, and I had my faith for probably about a month or 6 weeks after I found out. And after that, it was the response from the church of him, their attitude to him, that really broke that for me. He was he'd had to live away from my town for a while, but he wanted to come back and be part of the community again, be part of the church. And the church were willing to do that and have him back, with some conditions around his attendance and things like that. So they weren't just going to let him back in. But for me, the response, the prioritization of him rather than the community healing, just the thought of just being in the space, even if I'd managed to avoid him at the particular times or whatever, no thanks.
No, that could be really awkward for you as well. I mean, you're basically guilty by association.
Right.
And then he comes back and, I mean, that's just going to be weird for everybody. And I'm assuming that this is a small church.
It had a few hundred.
Small-ish.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite a big church for the place I grew up. There were people who didn't know either of us in it.
Okay.
But also people who, there were lots of people who knew me. There were lots of people who knew him, and people who knew we'd been together. Although I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty certain that if the news would have got around that we weren't together, thankfully, when he was arrested. We'd broken up. We had been broken up for some time. The time frames are tricky for me. I know roughly, but it's that sort of trauma element is still present sometimes. I can't remember the exact dates, but there was definitely some, about a couple of months in between us breaking up and him being arrested. So grateful for that. But yeah, the church response, I think, just conversations I had with some of the church leaders in, take some time up, take 3 weeks and get over it. It's all life. I'm sure I'll just get over it. I think because it went to the heart of my understanding of what religion was about and what Christianity was about. I was a fervent believer. I really believed everything. And there's some things I struggled with and questioned, but not on any big way and any large scale. So I felt like I didn't know who to trust anymore. I didn't know. These church leaders were saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to bring him back," and because that was consistent with the doctrine of forgiveness, which I get, like that's what they preach. But also it's kind of spiritual bypassing for me. It was kind of like, we haven't acknowledged the enormity of what the impact on this community has had. And I can look at myself and say, well, Claire, of course it affected you a lot more in a different way to, maybe somebody else. But equally, I know I wasn't the only one who felt like that. And I didn't stay in long enough to find many allies in this, but I heard some years later that there were others, I think, who left based on this situation. And, I have a little more compassion for the leadership at that point than I used to. But I still don't agree with their approach. It was a different time, and we hadn't had Me Too, and we hadn't had the safeguarding context in church situations that we did today. But equally, my gut told me at that point, this isn't how we should be dealing with this. This isn't how we focus our approach on rehabilitating this guy back into the church whilst ignoring the congregation, who are basically wondering how long this man had deceived people, and who else might be if this was the nice guy who helped old ladies across the road type. I remember being told that he'd been arrested, and I was thinking, like, for what? Like, when we were going out, if there'd been a fight, I would be more likely to start it than him. He was really not that kind of guy. So I was just racking my brains, like, what could he possibly have been arrested for? So that level of like, you don't know this person, like, who can you trust? And then everyone around me saying, like, you can't let this affect your faith. And that's not a direct quote from anyone, but basically that was the vibe I felt like from some of the people in the church. And I just thought, how can you continue without this affecting you? And I just didn't know what to believe or who to trust. And after that, why would I believe this anyway? Like, what, why would it support me in my life if this is the kind of thing that happens in the community that I thought so much of? So yeah, it was quite a on the moment decision, like, for me to think, yeah, I don't want to be part of this anymore. But on the other side of that, I still trusted the community to an extent, as in the people that I knew there, the relationships I already had, my close Christian girlfriends. Whilst I had distance from them, it would take a lot longer for me to sort of those relationships to fade, which was great, obviously, for me to still have my friends around me. But the more I've had to deconstruct my faith, the more I realized, like, how much conditioning we had, and those beliefs, when they're really embedded as a child, when you're embedded, as a child, you're taught these things. It goes really deep, and it takes a lot of inner work to deconstruct and find the root of that, and then rebuild a new set of beliefs. So there were times when I thought, I'll try. A few years later, for example, I thought, I'll try going to church again and see how I get on. And it didn't last.
I can imagine. I mean, because that's sort of a betrayal, you go through your life believing this.
Mm.
From a small child, this is what you're taught. And then as an adult, you see what happens.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, are we really going to be accepting and forgiving of everyone and everything?
Yeah, for everything.
And
Yeah.
where's the line?
Yeah.
Is there ever a line? And then,
Yeah.
you start questioning things, and then it's rolls into, I'm done. I'm just done. And that's such a betrayal. I
Yeah.
mean, what was the process for you? Like, when you did leave, did you tell friends? I mean, I'm sure you told your friends and family, but what were some of the reactions that you got when you were like, hey, this is what happened, and this is why I'm no longer a part of this church?
Yeah. So in the immediate, I was doing this volunteer work for the church. So I was, I had keys to some of the buildings. And I remember just being like, I remember helping at one of the youth groups that was scheduled to do it. And I didn't sat with this kid who was having a rough day, I think. And he just was being all stubborn and moody. And I was just like, I'm with you, kid, we get it.
I
And
can
I went in.
relate.
Yeah. And I went into the kitchen and a couple of the other women who were helping. And I was just sort of on the verge of tears. I was like, I just don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what I'm doing. And they said, like, you don't have to be here. And that was great. It was giving me permission to leave that evening. I mean, everything was pretty much over anyway, but it made me, I guess I allowed myself to be like, yeah, actually, I need to not be here. I'm not helping anything in this. I'm not being a great volunteer at this moment. I'm supposed to be sitting with this, these single moms in the baby and, mum and baby group and telling them about Jesus. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know if I believe in Jesus. So maybe it wasn't like helping much anyway. But that kind of like, I'm grateful to them. They kind of said like, permission to go, if you're not feeling it. And actually that led on to I'm not going to do this voluntary scheme anymore. I'm going to just forget it. And I got some more hours at the job I was doing as well, the paid job, and just sort of threw myself into work. But when I told my friends, there were mixed reactions. And I think my immediate family actually were great in that they didn't try and argue with me or persuade me to stay or do anything particular. Although, subsequently, several years later, that, they have encouraged me to go back to church and that sort of thing, but to no good result, sadly for them. But yeah, some of the reactions were surprised. Some of them had said, well, like what one of my friends said, like, you'll lose your faith if you don't go to church. And I thought to myself, like, I was annoyed at the time, and I thought to myself, well, it's not much of faith if if it deserts me when I don't go. So that was an interesting one. But again, I have compassion on her in a similar situation growing up in that environment. So for a long time, I couldn't talk about this story without crying. Years really, I couldn't share it. I was afraid of sharing it often. Sexual abuse abuse of children is not an easy topic to talk about for most people, and a lot of people haven't had that
Right,
connection to
but
it.
I think you don't have to have a connection to it to understand that it's horrific.
Sure. I think
And everyone has the same reaction when it comes to kids.
yeah.
It's things like that should never happen to children, or it should never happen to anybody, but especially to children.
What I found interesting actually was my own perspective so when the story about, I would say, Boston Catholic priests and abuse situations from that story broke, admittedly, again, across the pond. It wasn't in the UK, but that story I remember breaking. And that was when I was still in the church. And my perspective nowadays on that story was, while I was in the church, I wrote that off. I almost gasped at myself and like saying, well, that was the Catholics. They're not proper Christians, which is something I was taught about. That they're sort of, they believe in the Pope. That's not real Christianity.
A lot of Catholics are going to disagree with you there.
Maybe, but that's what I was taught. And I'm not saying it's right. That's just what I was taught. But that idea that you kind of separate denominations, for example, like a lot of Christians, I believe, have said to me, or they've experienced, well, that denomination doesn't do things right, so therefore we're different. And it's such a dangerous idea because you find abuse, for example, in every denomination, in every religion. And to say somehow that like, oh, that denomination isn't right, so therefore what can you expect but get abuse? That's a very direct and blunt thing to say. And like, they never say it like that. But that kind of feels like the insinuation. And so, like, why aren't we just addressing this issue? One of the things that I question now, and I ask people if I get the opportunity, is to say, like, if God's people, if Christians are God's people, or if any religion is supposed to be of God, why aren't they leading the way on things like feminism and dealing with abuse and safeguarding? Like, why aren't they ahead of the game? Because if they're behind, which a lot of the time they are, or they're not dealing with it within their own denominations, or it keeps coming up in their own denominations, then like, what's the reason for that? And that's, for me, that kind of questioning and that kind of critical thinking, I would have been very afraid of when I was growing up, because that's the kind of challenging question that would have threatened my faith. And when it's such a part of your identity, and again, I have sympathy for anyone who is brought up in a religious situation like I was, that was essentially indoctrinated into something when they were born. And a lot of my social life and my activities were centered around church. Like to have to negate all of that and say, maybe that wasn't actually not right, but like it isn't, it's actually not the great thing you think it is. That's a lot to deal with. And that's been my journey over the last, like, well, 15 years at least. Because my identity was wrapped up in that whole
Right.
religious life, and all the stuff that comes with it. I mean, even when I was a teenager, contemporary Christian music as a genre was being defined in the US, but we were influenced by that. We had, we played this was some of the Third Day was one of my sort of CCM bands, and that, like, there's a whole industry around that, and to challenge that is a big thing. I don't do it lightly. I've lived it. I grew up with this, and I've experienced what happens when it doesn't go well. When some bad stuff happens, and I've felt ashamed, honestly, about the things that I used to believe and these things that I used to say. I wasn't particularly overtly evangelical. I would have the conversation with my school friends if they said, why do you believe what you believe? I'd engage, but I wouldn't go around Bible bashing. I don't think that wasn't very British, if nothing else. So yeah, there's a lot that I do challenge, and I'm not afraid to challenge, because I can stand in, like, this is my lived experience, and I hate the feeling of I hated the feeling of betrayal. I hate it if I feel it. It's less so now, but that betrayal that I felt, mostly just because I don't want other people to experience that. I always say adults can believe what they want. If you want to believe in, like, a purple monster in the sky, fine, but be careful what you teach your children, because the distinction, the conceptual idea of a God and beliefs is taken very literally when you're a child. And the idea of hell being a burning fire, when you're learning not to put your hand in the fire,
Mhm.
means that there's you're learning under duress, essentially, if you believe that, if you get taught that if you don't believe in Jesus, you'll go to hell. It's very, very, I think it's just a really important thing to know. And be aware of when you have children. And of course, you can't control everything that a child gets exposed to or believes. But I'm not a parent, and I don't have that scenario. But I think that parents need to be aware that children do absorb a lot, and normalizing some of the stuff that I wouldn't take my child to church to hear the Bible being read up from the front, even if it's only, during the holiday times when they don't have Sunday school. But like the normalization of, like, a genocide or rape from the Old Testament, just because that's read in church, like, I don't think that's healthy for a child or its development. It feels that was part of my deconstruction process, is realizing, like, actually, why was I exposed to that when I was young? And it's this idea that religion has this sort of automatic authority of, like, goodness, when actually does it? Like, we can just love each other without the Jesus story.
Yeah. I feel like there's such a hierarchy in religions too. It's like everyone thinks that their religion is better than the next. And there's a self-righteousness that goes along with it. It's like the Catholics versus the Episcopals, right? So it's like
Yeah.
Catholicism light. And, I grew up in a town that was full of Catholics, and I am not religious. I did not grow up with any religious upbringing whatsoever. Some of my family went to church and was very religious, and my mom did actually try it for a little while, but I questioned everything. I'm like, how did two animals go from there to there? And what this just didn't make any sense to me. I think that there's a lot of this picking and choosing,
Mm.
and it's like people talk about faith. Well, what does faith mean to you? My faith could mean something completely different than your faith. And I have a lot of friends that were raised in a religion and ultimately left that religion. And their view of reality is so skewed
Hmm.
because, or it was coming out because they were taught at a very young age that this is your reality. So
Mm.
when they leave, when something happens, like in your instance, when they leave and they're like, wait a minute, I don't know how to live.
Yeah.
I don't know how to be in the world anymore.
Yeah.
And this is why I have an issue with organized religion
Yeah.
because we're teaching people that there is only one way of life and you're not allowed to experience anything else.
Mhm. Yeah.
And what's the point of that? Someone please explain the point of that to me.
I believe there's an agenda which is the sort of, not sure I love using this term, but wounded masculine. There's a control element that if you can control someone's beliefs, particularly when they're young, then they will continue your ideas and values in a way that I think adults who perpetuate the religious ideas and are really strict about it often have come from that, they were indoctrinated themselves.
It
I can
perpetuates
see that.
itself.
Right. But some of us have to break the cycles. But I think there's definitely, and I think this is where I can, with a bit of distance from the US, because it's not our government. Knowing a sort of Christian nationalist agenda, that feels very familiar to me. The idea of male leadership and the woman in the home, that wasn't overtly taught where I grew up. But there was male headship in our church. So there were no female preachers or leaders. By the time I was in my late teens, the women were serving communion. And I think, as far as I understand now, the church I grew up, it does have women preachers now. But I know how much that doctrine influenced me in the choices that I made and the way I relate to men and authority and my own voice. And I know that how I see it in clients and friends and people I interact with who've been in similar situations about, or even Christians I come across, Christian women who I know or come across, that the way they relate to themselves as women and their own authority and sovereignty. And that kind of, even the fact that the Christian God is male, I've seen people on social media try to defend that doctrine. But for me now, from being in that, knowing how influenced I was, and now looking back thinking, yeah, this is just a justification for you not to have female representation in authority in the church. And why not? Because you'd probably challenge the shit out of
Right?
like
Yep.
that, the outspoken women who don't care what the men think, teaching the Bible in a different way, would threaten the existence of the church, and I
Yeah,
mean, I think is. So
for sure.
there is an agenda, and I think that's what I can see that, the sort of, we've mentioned Project 2025.
Yeah. I could go on and on about that whole thing. It's so ridiculous, but continue.
Well, I'm not like, I haven't read it all, but I know the signs, shall we say. I know that, I know the thought, I know the thinking, I know the thought processes because I was brought up in that. So and having deconstructed a lot of it, I feel more confident in arguing against it. And just before I was speaking to you, I was listening to a bit of Christopher Hitchens, who's the late Christopher Hitchens, who was a British journalist, essentially, and speaker and author. And he was very critical of religion, and some of his, and sort of Richard Dawkins, atheist speakers like Richard Dawkins, author as well. They both spoke a lot. They both spoke very critically and logically about religion and its influence. And a lot of my deconstruction has been supported by that. Their critical thinking and their explanations of that have really supported the journey I've been on, because I wasn't taught to critically think about the church and spiritual things because it was presented as one way. And yes, there was an element that I was taught to not accept everything I learned, and particularly interestingly, when I went away to, like, if we went away to sort of summer youth camps and things like that, I'd be like, don't necessarily believe everything, like discern what they're saying and check it in the Bible and stuff. But so there was an element of it to an extent, but the kind of core tenets of like Christianity, I was never supported in challenging that to any kind of great degree. Like, yes, we could doubt God. Yes, we could question God, but not believe in God, that wasn't an option.
Yeah.
So that sort of lack of critical thinking around, particularly around male authority, was really damaging to me. I struggled for a long time in saying, if I think something and a man thinks something, then his way of thinking is automatically the right one, because men are allowed to preach and teach and women aren't. So I can't have been right. I can never have been right. If I'd put something to him and he'd agreed with it, then it would have been okay. But like, me
Yeah.
putting something to him, him disagreeing, is essentially is like a shunning of my ideas. And so trusting in myself, obviously, has been a journey for me too. And choosing something else, choosing another way. That's not the sort of expected route or traditional Christian ideas, that sort of thing.
I always, from a very young age, well, teens, I saw people in my community, people in my family, go to church on Sunday and then commit like the worst stuff during the week. And that really got me thinking. It didn't make sense to me. And then people who hide behind religion to, use it as sort of a
Mm.
shield
Mhm.
and use it as a justification to do heinous things. There's so much wrapped into religion that is designed to keep women down. And I know in one of my friends who left a religion, I'm not going to mention names, I'm not going to say the religion, but they shunned a woman from the church because she was a single parent and she had an affair and ended up, her and her husband got a divorce and they shunned her from the church because of her situation. I'm like, well, what happened to the husband? He also got the divorce. Did he get shunned from the church? No. And that was the turning point for one of my friends.
Yeah.
They were like, okay, this is,
Yeah.
I'm just questioning this. So that's my huge beef. And especially with Project 2025, since you brought it up, I did read it.
Yeah.
And it is completely designed to control, control, control. This small majority wants to use Christian nationalism to control everything about women and about society. And people are falling for it.
Mm. Yeah.
It's this belief that, well, if it's God speaking or if it's Jesus, then that makes it okay. Or they can
Mm.
just use God as a label and, slap God as a label on it and say, yep, God said this. So now it's legal. What
Yeah.
happened to separation of church and state?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's as a similar. It's not quite the same situation over here, but we do still have that kind of integration as a sort of dependency on the. We have bishops in the. I feel like there's some movement to change this, but bishops within one of our houses of parliament that have like automatic seats basically, and just because they're bishops. But absolutely, and I think nowadays that a lot of people don't go to church or they don't recognize Christianity as their religion, even though that's traditionally we're a Christian nation as Britain. Then there's this sort of as I say, like an underlying assumption that must be a positive thing, but actually those people who don't engage religion at all, they weren't brought up in it, they don't know anything about it, then why would they think that was, why would that be normal? Why would that be acceptable for them? Because that's not representative of who they are. And there's this idea that religion kind of drives morality, whereas who says like,
Yeah.
what about innate morality? That was a really interesting conversation I had with a boyfriend a while back, that who said like religion isn't like the monopoly of morality. Like he didn't grow up religious, and he says, "Are you trying to tell me I'm like not moral?" And I was like, "No, this is my conditioning telling me that the religion and morality connected." And kind of tying back to your point about picking and choosing, that was one of the things that was the most surprising or shocking things, that when I came out of the church, realizing that not everyone believed everything in the same way that I did in the church, not just, within the wider world. Of course, I knew that Christians believe different things, but people did pick and choose their beliefs. And I was like, surely you have to believe all of it or like nothing, you can't have it both ways, but people do. And they don't see a problem with it
Yeah,
in
no,
a
'cause
way.
it's their narrative. If it's
Right. And
what
their
they
lifestyle.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
And that's not to condemn that. Like as I say, like adults can believe what they want. If you want to believe that you have to go through a pope to get to God, or you want to you want to just go to a nice space with some music and pretty ornaments around and things like that, fine. The assumption that that's a good thing, that it's beneficial to everyone regardless of what they believe, that's where I feel like, hang on, that shouldn't be an assumption. That if you individually want to believe that, great, crack on, but you telling your children that's the way to live and that's the right way to live, I think. And when there's an all or nothing element to it, when there's a if you don't believe this you will go to hell element, which is what I experience, and I appreciate that not all religious parents are like that, but that's if a lot of children do grow up in that environment, and I believe that is traumatic for them, that it is abusive, that it could be considered a sort of grooming, that you are conditioning your child to believe something in order for an agenda for their life and their belief system, mainly due to my experiences where I had to really shift from Christianity as the truth to Christianity as a belief system. So when you're taught is truth, then everything else is false. So
Yeah.
of course you want to believe it. Whereas if it's a belief system, there's a lot more element of choice in there. And that distinction is really important, I think. I don't think it's fair to put that on a small child and attach a lot of conditions or behaviors or anything to it. And that's where my like to challenge those ideas, even when people who particularly, I mean, in England, we have a sort of middle class Church of England attending, Radio 4 listening, BBC Radio 4 listening type of person, sort of stereotype that is very kind of non-offensive. And, I don't wish to slate them at all. But that comes with that, this underlying assumption that if you go to church, you're probably a nice person and you do good works and you're kind to people. But I don't like that association, in the sense that I don't think it should be associated with a religion. You could be a nice, good person and not go to church. And the nice, good people that went to my church were really nice about this man who was an abuser. And I would have been the same person. I would have been that person that said, oh yeah, he's a great guy. But actually he wasn't. He was abusing a child. And that's what I've learned subsequently, that abusers are attracted to church situations. And I believe they can also we cultivate an environment in churches that supports abusers a lot of the time, because we're trusting people. And that's a good thing to be, but it also can create the conditions for abuse to thrive. And there's evidence of that, obviously, with across churches and other religions, and not just churches, but that's obviously my background, but other religions as well. And I want to challenge people about that. And I do challenge people about that, because I don't think it's helpful for our society to grow or culture to develop in a positive way, because abuse is a problem and we have to look at it. I'm not sure that answered your question, but we went on a tangent.
No, it's okay. I mean, I could go on about this subject for days. I mean, it's something that I'm super passionate about, because if religion forces you to ostracize people and to hate people and to spread hate, then that's not a religion. Because I thought that God loved everyone, God accepted everyone. If everyone was made in God's image, then why are you hating other people?
Yeah.
And that is the question that I pose to everyone who is like, okay, well, this person is of this orientation, so they don't deserve to be loved. They don't deserve to be in, God's presence. I have a huge problem with that, because number one, who made you in charge?
Yeah.
Who made you in charge to say this person can be accepted or this person cannot? And what people don't understand is that the Bible was actually put together by Emperor Constantine.
Mm.
And it's several books that he had translated and written, and it's anecdotal, and he had them all put together. And a lot of people don't realize that, but they want to take this book and use it to weaponize. And is that really what it was intended for?
I mean, it's a great question. And I know that my upbringing was, and this is partly influenced by my parents' careers in the law, which would have defaulted to, if you had a question, you look at the text, you look at what it says in writing, you look at the terms and conditions. So there is a little bit of that influence definitely coming into it. But definitely in the church, the authority was the Bible. If it said it in black and white, like that was what it was. And I remember when probably a couple of years before I left, there was a conversation going on about, women in leadership. To start with, that conversation was going on already. And also homosexuality, not so overtly. It wasn't discussed hugely in the church I grew up in, or I don't remember it being. But
It's a big
ultimately,
topic here.
right. And then it may have been that it didn't necessarily impact me. I didn't, I can't speak for all the teaching that was happening. But I would have said, if you'd asked me back then, like, what does God say about homosexuality? I just said, well, this is what it says in the Bible. And there was some nuance that I was taught in terms of the Old Testament being sometimes contextual, like as in this was a historical situation. And I was kind of almost like not taught to specific answers, but there was approach I certainly copied from others in the church of how to deal with questions like that. But the reality is it's homophobic and it's racist and it supports, this talks about slavery. And you can say that that is a historical document and that we can just ignore those bits, but people don't. That is the problem.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that kind of, that going kind of back to the picking and choosing that I didn't realize until I left, that I really was in a very all or nothing world where you have to believe in the Bible and you believe it all or nothing kind of thing. And I struggled with that sometimes, even at the time, even as a Christian. And I would often sort of sit on the fence about things. I wouldn't kind of commit myself either way. But ultimately, my decision-making process came down to that sort of, if it's in the book, then that's the authority. That's God's word to us. We should rely on. And when there's a verse about, famous one in 2 Timothy, about women shall not speak, or they should be silent, they should not have authority over a man, she must be silent. I really struggled with reconciling, like, well, logically that's the conclusion I come to, is that women shouldn't be preachers. And I've defended that position when I was a Christian, because I believed it. That's what I was taught, that's what I grew up with. That didn't mean I didn't have questions about it, and I appreciated that there were arguments around it. But these days, why are we putting so much authority on this book?
We've evolved.
Right, but some religious people would say that we shouldn't
Right.
we should stick to what is said in the text, that they are full and complete and whole, and this is the revealed word. And that has implications when you're trying to make policies for a country,
Well,
or you're trying to influence people even just in your social circles. So yeah, I have not looked at a Bible many. I had enough Bible to last me a
yeah.
lifetime.
Yeah, too. Well, the Bible is like the law, right? It's all left up to interpretation. Yes, it's written in black and white. Yes, it's text, but it can be manipulated. It can be interpreted in all different kinds of ways. It's all in who the person is, what their narrative is, what's the point they're trying to prove. It's all left up to that.
Yeah. And I think there's again, I think I just come back to the argument, like, if you're going to teach a child about a religious belief, then allow them to come to their own conclusions rather than teach them this is the way. Because if they then, even for myself, in terms of kind of a mental health perspective, if your then lived experience comes up against that and you think, how can these two be reconciled? It's a very distressing experience to have that confrontation.
Right.
And have to resolve it one way or the other. I'm grateful to have access to authors who were critical of religion and watch YouTube videos and talk to people and do a lot of inner work around that, to realize the beliefs that I had and actually look at them for what they were and challenge them. And even that process, that critical thinking process, being almost denied to me from a spiritual perspective, because I was taught there was only one way. And I think that just the harm that can be caused by that is really significant.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I could keep talking about this with you all day. Like, this is a topic that I'm very passionate about. So we'll have to do a part 2.
That sounds good. I'm in.
All right. If people want to find you, where can they find you at?
Yes. Instagram, Facebook, and x.com for the time being. But yes, I think you're going to put them in the links
I'll
in the
put
show
them
notes.
all in the show notes. Yeah, for sure.
Please connect if you've had that experience. I always open to hearing about ex-religious people or questioning people who are in religions.
Yeah, absolutely. Alrighty. Well,
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. This is a hard topic to talk about, and not a lot of people are up to talking about it because it is so controversial. I mean, you start, questioning people's religion, it's like you're literally questioning their God. So, I really do appreciate your vulnerability and your perspective and your courage to come on here and share exactly how you feel, what's happened in your experiences.
Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to share and share with other people because who may feel isolated, have the same experience or have a similar experience. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. And if you're listening to this and you find yourself in the same position as Claire and you're thinking about maybe leaving a religion, get in touch with her. She won't bite, I promise. She's super nice. All right. Well, thanks for hanging out with us on Fine, I'll Talk About It. If today's episode got you thinking, hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And if you want more real talk, more perspective shifts, and more finally someone said it moments, leave a quick review. It helps other people find the show. You can connect with me on Instagram at Inspired Action Wellness or on my website, inspiredactionwellness.com, for more conversations like this. I will see you in the next episode.